In the middle of the summer, Lori found us an apartment in a neighborhood we could afford, the South Bronx. The yellow Art Deco building must have been pretty fancy when it opened, but now graffiti covered the outside walls, and the cracked mirrors in the lobby were held together with duct tape. Still, it had what Mom called good bones. Our apartment was bigger than the entire house on Little Hobart Street, and way fancier. It had shiny oak parquet floors, a foyer with 2 steps leading down into the living room where I slept, and off to the side a bedroom that became Lori's. We also had a kitchen with a working refrigerator and a gas stove that had a pilot light, so you didn't need matches to get it going. You just turned the dial, listened to the clicking, then watched the circle of blue flame flare up through the tiny holes in the burner. My favorite room was the bathroom. It had a black and white tile floor, a toilet that flushed with a powerful whoosh, a tub so deep you could submerge yourself completely in it, and hot water that never ran out. It didn't bother me that the apartment was in a rough neighborhood. We'd always lived in rough neighborhoods. Puerto Rican kids hung out on the block at all hours, playing music, dancing, sitting on abandoned cars, clustering at the entrance to the elevated subway station and in front of the bodega that sold single cigarettes called Lucy's. I got jumped a number of times. People were always telling me that if I was robbed, I should hand over my money rather than risk being killed. But I was darned if I was going to give some stranger my hard-earned cash, and I didn't want to become known as in the neighborhood as the easy target, so I always fought back. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. What worked best was to keep my wits about me. Once as I was getting on the train, some guy tried to grab my purse, but I jerked it back and the strap broke. He fell empty-handed to the platform floor, and as the train pulled out, I looked through the window and gave him a big sarcastic wave. That fall, Lori helped me find a public school where instead of going to classes, the students signed up for internships all over the city. One of my internships was at the Phoenix, a weekly newspaper run out of a dingy storefront on Atlantic Avenue in downtown Brooklyn, near the old X-Lax factory. The owner, publisher, and editor-in-chief was Mike Armstrong. He saw himself as a muckraking gadfly and had mortgaged his brownstone 5 times to keep the Phoenix going. The staff all used Underwood manual typewriters with threadbare ribbons and yellow keys. The E on mine was broken, so I used the at in its place. We never had copy paper and instead wrote on discarded press releases we dug out of the trash. At least once a month, someone's paycheck bounced. Reporters were always quitting in disgust. In the spring, when Mr. Armstrong was interviewing a journalism school graduate for a job opening, a mouse ran over her foot and she screamed. After she left, Mr. Armstrong looked at me. The Brooklyn Zoning Board was meeting that afternoon and he had no one to cover it. If you start calling me Mike instead of Mr. Armstrong, he said, you can have the job. I just turned 18. I quit my job at the hamburger joint the next day and became a full-time reporter for the Phoenix. I'd never been happier in my life. I worked 90-hour weeks. My telephone rang constantly. I was always hurrying off to interviews and checking the $10 Rolex I'd bought on the street to make sure I wasn't running late. Rushing back to file my copy, staying up till 4 a.m. to set type when the typesetter quit, and I was bringing home $125 a week, if the check cleared. I wrote Brian long letters describing the sweet life in New York City. He wrote back saying things in Welch are still going downhill. Dad was drunk all the time except when he was in jail. Mom had completely withdrawn into her own world, and Maureen was more or less living with the neighbors. The ceiling in the bedroom had collapsed, and Brian had moved his bed onto the porch. He made walls by nailing boards along the railings, but it leaked pretty badly out there, too, so he still slept under the inflatable raft. I told Lori that Brian should come live with us in New York, and she agreed, but I was afraid Brian would want to stay in Welch. He seemed more of a country boy than a city kid. He was always wandering through the woods, tinkering with a discarded 2-stroke engine, chopping wood, or carving a block of wood into an animal head. He'd never complained about Welch, and unlike Lori and me, he'd made a lot of friends there. But I thought it was in Brian's long-term interest to get out of the town. I made a list of reasons he should move to New York so I could argue him into it. I called him at Grandpa's and presented my case. He'd need to get a job to pay his share of the rent and groceries, and I said, but jobs were going begging in the city. He could share the living room with me. There was plenty of space for a second bed. The toilet flushed and the ceiling never leaked. When I finished, Brian was silent for a moment. Then he said, when's the soonest I can come? Just like me, Brian hopped the Trailways bus the morning after completing his junior year. The day after he got to New York, he found a job at an ice cream parlor in Brooklyn, not far from the Phoenix. He said he liked Brooklyn better than Manhattan or the Bronx, but he also developed a habit of dropping by the Phoenix when he got off work and waiting for me until 3 or 4 in the morning so we could take the subway together up to the South Bronx. He never said anything, but I think he figured that as when we were kids, we both stood a better chance if we took on the world together. I now saw no point in going to college. It was expensive, and my aim in going would have been to get a degree to qualify me for a job as a journalist. But I now had my job at the Phoenix. As for the learning itself, I figured you didn't need a college degree to become one of the people who knew what was really going on. If you paid attention, you could pick things up on your own. And so if I overheard mention of something I was ignorant about, keeping kosher, Tammany Hall, haute couture, I researched it later on. One day, I interviewed a community activist who described a particular job program as a throwback to the Progressive era. I had no idea what the Progressive era was, and back in the office I got out the World Book Encyclopedia. Mike Armstrong wanted to know what I was doing, and when I explained, he asked me if I'd ever thought of going to college. Why should I give up this job to go to college? I asked. You've got college graduates working here who are doing what I'm doing. You may not believe this, he said, but there are better jobs out there than the one you've got now. You might get one of them one of these days, but not without a college degree. Mike promised me that if I went to college, I could come back to the Phoenix anytime I wanted, but he added he didn't think I would. Lori's friends told me that Columbia University was the best in New York City. Since it took only men at the time, I applied to its sister college, Bernard, and was accepted. I received grants and loans to cover most of the tuition, which was steep, and I'd saved a little money while working at the Phoenix. But to pay for the rest, I had to spend a year answering phones at a Wall Street firm. Once school started, I could no longer pay my share of the rent, but a psychologist let me have a room in her Upper West Side apartment in exchange for looking after her 2 small sons. I found a weekend job at an art gallery, crowded all my classes into 2 days, and became the news editor of the Bernard Bulletin. But I gave that up when I was hired as an editorial assistant, 3 days a week at one of the biggest magazines in the city. Writers there had published books and covered wars and interviewed presidents. I got to forward their mail, check their expense accounts, and do word counts on their manuscripts. I felt I'd arrived. Mom and Dad called us now and then from Grandpa's to bring us up to date on life in Welch. I began to dread those calls, since every time we heard from them there was a new problem. A mudslide had washed away what was left of the stairs. Our neighbors, the Freemans, were trying to get the house condemned. Maureen had fallen off the porch and gashed her head. When Lori heard that, she declared it was time for Maureen to move to New York too. But Maureen was only 12, and I wondered that she might be too young to leave home. She'd been 4 when we moved to West Virginia, and it was all she really knew. Who's going to look after her? I asked. I will, Lori said. She can stay with me. Lori called Maureen, who got squealy with excitement about the idea, and then Lori talked to Mom and Dad. Mom thought it was a great plan, but Dad accused Lori of stealing his children and declared he was disowning her. Maureen arrived in early winter. By then, Brian had moved into a walk-up near the Port Authority bus terminal, and using his address, we enrolled Maureen in a good public school in Manhattan. On weekends, we all met at Lori's apartment. We made fried pork chops or heaping plates of spaghetti and meatballs and sat around talking about Welch, laughing so hard at the idea of all that craziness that our eyes watered. One morning, 3 years after I moved to New York, I was getting ready for class and listening to the radio. The announcer reported a terrible traffic jam in the New Jersey Turnpike. A van had broken down, spilling clothes and furniture all over the road and creating a big backup. The police were trying to clear the highway, but a dog had jumped out of the van and was running up and down the turnpike as a couple of officers chased after him. The announcer got a lot of mileage out of the story, going on about the rubes with their clunker of a vehicle and yapping dog who were making thousands of New York commuters late for work. That night, the psychologist told me I had a phone call. Jeanettekins, it was Mom. Guess what? She asked in a voice brimming with excitement. Your daddy and I have moved to New York. The first thing I thought about was the van that had broken down on the turnpike that morning. When I asked Mom about it, she admitted that yes, she and Dad had a teensy bit of a technical difficulty with the van. It had popped a belt on some big crowded highway, and Tinkle, who was sick and tired of being cooped up, you know how that goes, had gotten loose. The police had shown up and Dad got into an argument with them, and they threatened to arrest him, and gosh, it was quite the drama. How'd you know? She asked. It was on the radio. On the radio? Mom asked. She couldn't believe it. With everything going on in the world these days, an old van popping a belt is news. But there was genuine glee in her voice. We only just got here. We're already famous. After talking to Mom, I looked around my room. It was the maid's room off the kitchen. It was tiny, with one narrow window and a bathroom that doubled as a closet. But it was mine. I had a room now, and I had a life, too, and there was no place in either one for Mom or Dad. Still, the next day I went up to Lori's apartment to see them. Everyone was there. Mom and Dad hugged me. Dad pulled up a pint of whiskey out of a paper bag while Mom described their various adventures on the trip. They had gone sightseeing earlier in that day and taken their first ride on the subway, which Dad called a goddamn hole in the ground. Mom said the Art Deco murals at Rockefeller Center were disappointing, not nearly as good as some of her own paintings. None of the kids, was doing much to help carry the conversation. "So what's the plan?" Brian finally asked. "You're moving here?" "We have moved," Mom said. "For good?" I asked. "That's right," Dad said. "Why?" I asked. The question came out sharply. Dad looked puzzled, as if the answer should have been obvious. "So we can be a family again?" He raised his pint. "To the family," he said. Mom and Dad had found a room in a boarding house a few blocks from Lori's apartment. The steely-haired landlady helped them move in, and a couple months later, when they fell behind in their rent, she put their belongings on the street and padlocked their room. Mom and Dad moved into a 6-story flop house in a more dilapidated neighborhood. They lasted there a few months, but when Dad set their room on fire by falling asleep with a burning cigarette in his hand, they got kicked out. Brian believed that Mom and Dad needed to be forced to be self-sufficient, or they'd be dependent on us forever, so he refused to take them in. But Lori had moved out of the South Bronx and into an apartment in the same building as Brian, and she let them come and stay with her and Maureen. It would be just for a week or two, Mom and Dad assured her, but a month at the most, while they got Kitty together and looked for a new place. At one month at Lori's became 2 months, then 3 and 4. Each time I visited, the apartment was more jam-packed. Mom hung paintings on the walls, stacked street finds in the living room, and put colored bottles in the windows for that stained glass effect. The stacks reached the ceiling, and then the living room filled up, and Mom's collectibles and found art overflowed into the kitchen. But it was Dad who was really getting to Lori. While he hadn't found steady work, he always had mysterious ways of hustling up pocket money, and he'd come home at night drunk and gunning for an argument. Brian saw that Lori was on the verge of snapping, so he invited Dad to come live with him. He put a lock on the booze cabinet, but Dad had been there under a week when Brian came home and found that Dad had used a screwdriver to take the door off its hinges and then guzzled down every single bottle. Brian didn't lose his temper. He told Dad he had made a mistake by leaving liquor in the apartment. He said he'd allowed Dad to stay, but Dad had to follow some rules. The first being he had to stop drinking as long as he was there. "You're the king of your own castle, and that's the way it should be," Dad replied. "But it'll be a chilly day in hell before I bow to my own son." He and Mom still had the white van they'd driven up from West Virginia, and he started sleeping in that. Lori, meanwhile, had given Mom a deadline to clean out the apartment. But the deadline came and went, and so did a second and a third. Also, Dad was always dropping by to visit Mom, but then they got into such screeching arguments that the neighbors banged on the walls. Dad started fighting with them, too. "I can't take it anymore," Lori told me one day. "Maybe you're just going to have to kick Mom out," I said. "But she's my mother. It doesn't matter. She's driving you crazy." Lori finally agreed. It almost killed her to tell Mom she'd have to leave, and she offered to do whatever it took to help her get reestablished, but Mom insisted she'd be fine. "Lori's doing the right thing," she said to me. "Sometimes you need a little crisis to get your adrenaline flowing and help you realize your potential." Mom and Tinkle moved into the van with Dad. They lived there for a few months, but one day they left it in a no parking zone and it was towed. Because the van was unregistered, they couldn't get it back. That night they slept on a park bench. They were homeless. Mom and Dad called regularly from payphones to check up on us, and once or twice a month we'd all get together at Lori's. "It's not such a bad life," Mom told us after they'd been homeless for a couple months. "Don't you worry a lick about us," Dad added. "We've always been able to fend for ourselves." Excuse me. Mom explained that they'd been busy learning the ropes. They'd visited the various soup kitchens, sampling the cuisines, had their favorites. They knew which churches passed out sandwiches and when. They found the public libraries with good bathrooms where you could wash thoroughly. "We wash as far down as possible and as far up as possible, but we don't wash possible," was how Mom put it, and brush your teeth and shave. They fished newspapers from the trash cans and looked up free events. They went to plays and operas and concerts in the parks, listened to string quartets and piano recitals in office building lobbies, attended movie screenings, and visited museums. When they first became homeless, it was early summer, and they slept on park benches or in the bushes that lined park paths. Sometimes a cop would wake them up and tell them to move, but they'd just find some other place to sleep. During the day, they'd stash their bedrolls in the underbrush. You can't just live like this, I said. Why not? Mom said, being homeless is an adventure. As fall came and the days shortened and the weather cooled, Mom and Dad began spending more time in the libraries, which were warm and comfortable, and some of which remained open well into the evening. Mom was working her way through Balzac. Dad had become interested in chaos theory and was reading Los Alamos Science and the Journal of Statistical Physics. He said it already helped his pool game. What are you going to do when winter comes? I asked Mom. She smiled. Winter's one of my favorite seasons, she said. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to do whatever I could to take care of Mom and Dad, and part of me just wanted to wash my hands of them. The cold came early that year, and every time I left the psychologist's apartment, I found myself looking into the faces of the homeless people I passed on the street, wondering each time if one of them would turn out to be Mom or Dad. I usually gave homeless people whatever spare change I had, but I couldn't help feeling like I was trying to ease my conscience about Mom and Dad wandering the streets while I had a steady job and a warm room to come home to. One day I was walking down Broadway with another student named Carol when I gave some change to a young homeless guy. You shouldn't do that, Carol said. Why? It only encourages them. They're all scam artists. What do you know? I wanted to ask. I felt like telling Carol that my parents were out there too, that she had no idea what it was like to be down on your luck with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. But that would have meant explaining who I really was, and I wasn't about to do that. So at the next street corner, I went my way without saying a thing. I knew I should have stood up for Mom and Dad. I'd been pretty scrappy as a kid, and our family had always fought for one another, but back then we had no choice. The truth was I was tired of taking on people who ridiculed us for the way we lived. I just didn't have it in me to argue Mom and Dad's case to the world. That's why I didn't own up to my parents in front of Professor, I think it's Fuchs. She was one of my favorite teachers, a tiny, dark, passionate woman with circles under her eyes who taught political science. One day, Professor Fuchs asked if homelessness was the result of drug abuse and misguided entitlement programs, such as the conservatives explained, or did it occur, as the liberals argued, because of cuts in social service programs and the failure to create economic opportunity for the poor. Professor Fuchs called on me. I hesitated. Sometimes I think it's neither. Can you explain yourself? I think that maybe sometimes people get the lives they want. Are you saying homeless people want to live in the street? Professor Fuchs asked. Are you saying they don't want warm beds and roofs over their heads? Not exactly, I said. I was fumbling for words. They do, but if some of them were willing to work hard and make compromises, they might not have ideal lives, but they could make ends meet. Professor Fuchs walked around from behind her lectern. What do you know about the lives of the underprivileged? She asked. She was practically trembling with agitation. What do you know about the hardships and obstacles that the underclass face? The other students were staring at me. You have a point, I said. That January it got so cold you could see chunks of ice the size of cars floating down the Hudson River. On those midwinter nights, the homeless shelters filled up quickly. Mom and Dad hated the shelters. Human cesspools, Dad called them. Goddamn vermin pits. Mom and Dad preferred to sleep on the pews of the churches that opened their doors to the homeless. But in some nights, every pew in church was taken. Every church was taken. On those nights, Dad would end up in the shelter, but while Mom would show up at Lori's, tinkle and toe. At times like that, her cheerful facade would crack, and she'd start crying and confess to Lori that life in the streets could be hard, just really hard. For a while, I considered dropping out of Bernard to help. It felt unbearably selfish, just downright wrong to be indulging myself with an education in the liberal arts at a fancy private college while Mom and Dad were on the streets. But Lori convinced me that dropping out was a lame-brained idea. It wouldn't do any good, she said, and besides, dropping out would break Dad's heart. He was immensely proud that he had a daughter in college, and an Ivy League college at that. Every time he met someone new, he managed to work it into the first few minutes of conversation. Mom and Dad, Brian pointed out, had options. They could move back to West Virginia or Phoenix. Mom could work, and she was not destitute. She had her collection of antique Indian jewelry, which she kept in a self-storage locker. There was the 2-carat diamond ring Brian had found under the rotten lumber back in Welch. She wore it even when sleeping on the street. She still owned property in Phoenix, and she had the land in Texas, the source of her oil lease royalties. Brian was right. Mom did have options. I met her at a coffee shop to discuss them. First off, I suggested that she might think of finding an arrangement like mine, a room in someone's nice apartment in exchange for taking care of children or the elderly. I've spent my life taking care of other people, Mom said. Now it's time to take care of me. But you're not taking care of you. Do we have to have this conversation? Mom asked. I've seen some good movies lately. Can we talk about the movies? I suggested to Mom that she sell her Indian jewelry. She wouldn't consider it. She loved that jewelry. Besides, they were heirlooms and had sentimental value. I mentioned the land in Texas. That land's been in the family for generations, Mom said, and it's staying in the family. You never sell land like that. I asked about the property in Phoenix. I'm saving that for a rainy day. Mom, it's pouring. This is just a drizzle, she said. Monsoons could be ahead. She sipped her tea. Things usually work out in the end. What if they don't? That just means you haven't come to the end yet. She looked across the table and smiled at me with the smile you give people when you know you have all the answers to all their questions. And so we talked about movies. Mom and Dad survived the winter, but every time I saw them, they looked a little worse for wear, dirtier, more bruised, their hair more matted. Don't you fret a bit, Dad said. Have you ever known your old man to get himself in a situation he couldn't handle? I kept telling myself Dad was right, that they knew how to look after themselves and each other, but in the spring, Mom called me to say Dad had come down with tuberculosis. Dad almost never got sick. He was always getting banged up and then recovering almost immediately, as if nothing could truly hurt him. A part of me still believed all those childhood stories he told us about how invincible he was. Dad had asked that no one visit him, but Mom said she thought he'd be pretty pleased if I dropped by the hospital. I waited at the nurse's station while an orderly went to tell him he had a visitor. I thought Dad might be under an oxygen tent or lying in a bed coughing up blood into a white handkerchief, but after a minute he came hurrying down the hall. He was paler and more gaunt than usual, but despite all his years of hard living, he had aged very little. He still had all his hair, it was still coal black, and his dark eyes twinkled above the paper surgical mask he was wearing. He wouldn't let me hug him. Whoa, Nellie, stay back, he said. You're sure a sight for sore eyes, honey, but I don't want you catching this son of a bitch of a bug. Dad escorted me back to the TB ward and introduced me to all of his friends. Believe it or not, old Rex Walls did produce something worth bragging about, and here she is, he told them. Then he started coughing. Dad, are you going to be okay? I asked. Ain't none of us getting out of this alive, honey, Dad said. It was an expression he used a lot, and now he seemed to find a special satisfaction in it. Dad led me over to his cot. A neat pile of books was stacked next to it. He said his bout with TV had set him to pondering about mortality and the nature of the cosmos. He'd been stone cold sober since entering the hospital and reading a lot more about chaos theory, particularly about the work of Mitchell Feigenbaum, as a physicist at Los Alamos who had made a study of the transition between order and turbulence. Dad said he was damned if Feigenbaum hadn't made a persuasive case that turbulence was not in fact random but followed a sequential spectrum of varying frequencies. If every action in the universe that we thought was random actually conformed to a rational pattern, Dad said that implied the existence of a divine creator, and he was beginning to rethink his atheistic creed. I'm not saying there's a bearded old geezer named Yahweh up in the clouds deciding which football team's going to win the Super Bowl, Dad said, but if the quantum physics suggests that God exists, I'm more than willing to entertain the notion.